Here we have a 2001 Dodge Ram 1500 with about 200,000 miles on it. It's got a pretty worn out suspension. It's just real tired from all the miles. Audible creak coming from the control arms. It's got some pretty obvious busted ball joints, upper and lower. The bushings that connect the lower and upper control arm are probably pretty worn at this point as well, so we'll go ahead and replace those pieces. We're going to be replacing, we have upper control arm, same part number on both sides. We have lower control arm, these are different part numbers. We have just the bump stop, and then 1.5 inch riser for the coil spring. The tire removed, you can see blown out upper ball joint. Blown out lower. Tie rod in, blown out. It's for another project, another day. Bushings for upper control arm, again, just look worn. These upper ball joints and lower ball joints have been replaced. Initially they were stamped into the control arm. A cheap fix was just to remove the old ball joint and replace it, but obviously poor quality part as it's already blown out within maybe 2 years or so. So in any case, we'll get it done right this time. I removed these two 13/16 bolts from the brake caliper so I could remove my disc off. You're going to want to have something that you can hang your caliper on to keep as much tension off of the line as possible. I removed the 13/16 nut to drop the outer tie rod off. Make sure you fully disengage this nut before hammering the knuckle here to dislodge the tie rod in. If not, if you break this loose, this joint will spin as you try to loosen the nut. I removed a 19/32 bolt from the sway bar to potentially allow my lower control arm to drop freely away from this tension device. This model is not equipped with an ABS sensor. Added some compression to the lower control arm to allow relief from the shock absorber so I could remove a 3/4 inch nut and bolt. I removed 2 bolts from the upper end of the shock absorber to allow it to break free from the upper control arm. For the bottom bolt, I actually had to use vice grips to clamp on the upper part of this spindle here to hold it in place. With tension remaining on the lower control arm, I removed a 21mm crown bolt from the aftermarket upper ball joint and a 15/16 bolt from the lower control arm ball joint. With tension remaining on the lower control arm, I gave the upper ball joint 2 taps with a big fucking hammer to release the upper ball joint from the spindle. So to break the lower ball joint, I put the crown back on the spindle, the crown nut back on the lower ball joint, and used the jack to give it some pressure so I could put some tension on the lower control arm, which allowed me to hit the top of the spindle with the 4-pound hammer and break the spindle loose from the lower ball joint. With the ball joints broken loose, I was able to remove the spindle. I had to basically apply some pressure to the lower control arm to break my coil spring loose. Coil spring comes out. I removed 2 15/16 inch bolts from the top of the upper control arm. They have a nifty little bolt with a retainer that basically keeps it in place on the bottom side, so you don't need to hit the bolt from the top. Upper control arm is now removed. Got it side by side with a new piece just to compare, make sure the sizes are proper, and I'm reinstalling the right piece. Remove 2 bolts and nuts from the lower control arm mounting brackets to release the lower control arm from the vehicle. As you loosen that nut and bolt, it's gonna take tension off the gasket here, which will allow the control arm to basically drop freely. So be careful and make sure you don't have anything below the ball joint or even that lower control arm when you release those two nuts and bolts. We've got the old lower control arm, the new lower control arm, worn out lower ball joint, worn out bushings, some dry rotting. So you can replace these by pressing them out and pressing some new ones in. You can replace the lower ball joint by taking the bolts off and just replacing that piece. But I think for the price, for the value, it's probably best to just go ahead and replace the whole assembly. So here we have the upper control arm resting on the frame. As you see, the frame has a longer, a hole that the bolt can sit in. And what that does is it allows for you to adjust the upper control arm depth according to the frame, in relation to the frame. So ultimately you can affect the camber of the wheel by loosening these bolts and adjusting the position of the upper control arm. All that being said, what we'll have to do is we'll have to send this into the alignment shop to get everything tuned into spec accordingly. What I'm going to do for now is try my best to align the upper control arm with the impression that it formerly made on the frame. So you can barely see some of the indentions on the steel frame below the upper control arm. Just going to try my best to kind of get this thing lined up accordingly to try and minimize the amount of camber I put on the vehicle. Obviously it's not going to be perfect. You have a new part, you no longer have the worn out bushings. So again, we'll send this into the alignment shop. So I aligned the pivot arm as best I could for the upper control arm to keep the camber consistent with what was on originally. Right now I went ahead and torqued the bolts that connect the pivot arm to the frame. I went ahead and torqued them down to 150 foot-pounds. The bushings are going to remain loose until the suspension is under load, at which time I will go ahead and bolt those down. These are torsion bushings, so depending on where you tighten them up, that's where the bushing is going to kind of just stay in place. So if you were to tighten them up when you have no tension on the upper control arm, you compress it, it's going to put some torque on the bushings and they'll wear faster. So we'll just leave those unbolted for now. All right, at this point I have the upper control arm, lower control arm in place, ready for reassembly. We've removed the old lower control arm, upper control arm, spindle, coil spring. I made the mistake of starting work prior to receiving the coil spring. However, I have faith in the shipment company that it'll be here later on today, so I'll go ahead and get started on the other side. So since I was out getting some new pads to replace the highly worn front pads, went ahead and had the disc just measured to see if it was near the minimum thickness of 28.35 millimeters. We're at 29, so I went ahead and got those replaced. While I was out, I decided I was going to replace my Sway Bar end links. I don't know, Duralast parts. And we'll go ahead and replace the Sway Bar bushings as well, since we're already under here. So we'll add that to the list. While I'm under here, I was going to show you that you'll actually see some metal shavings coming off of the ball joint. Since it's lost all its grease and it's just worn down over time, it's metal on metal at this point. At some point that that metal on metal is just going to break down the compound, and eventually that joint is going to become compromised and break loose of the vehicle, causing a pretty devastating accident. So again, ball joints, clear indicators of broken boot, but just an important piece to maintain and update. So I probably could have completely removed the sway bar end link and basically dropped the sway bar out, but I left one in place just to help kind of keep it sturdy while I remove the old bushing. So yeah, we'll replace it with a new piece now. I'm gonna go ahead and leave this retention plate loose until the suspension is loaded in order to avoid affecting any torsion within the bushing there. So here we have the replacement coil spring. The vendor was kind enough to note which spring was the driver's side, so they are side specific. Okay, so here I have the old coil spring. One of the things I noticed was that the old and new coil spring both have a stamp on one end of the coil that's not seen on the bottom. I suspect that's the indicator for top versus bottom. For this one, the stamped end had the gasket around it, so it's seating in the frame, and the unstamped end will seat within the lower control arm, so I'll just install it that way on the new set. So I've got the 1.5 inch wheel spacer installed at the top of the coil spring, sitting in the frame. I have the coil spring, that straight edge, sitting in the recession of the lower control arm. I had this thing jacked up, pressure on the lower control arm to compress the spring, which allows me to connect the spindle to the lower ball joint and upper ball joint. I'm gonna go ahead and crank this one down to 95 foot-pounds per spec. Upper ball joint nut goes to 60 pounds. I went ahead and installed the nut for the sway bar end link. I just haven't torqued it down yet. I'm gonna wait till suspension's loaded to get that one down to spec as well. All right, so install the lower bolt for the shock absorber, and then compressed the lower control arm so I could get the upper end of the shock absorber fitted, and torqued down the upper bolts to 30 foot-pounds. Went ahead and attached the tie rod in to 65 foot-pounds, so we should get pretty close here. All right, got a new disc installed, some new pads installed, reconnected the caliper, installed the bump stock. I think this side should be pretty buttoned up. What I'll need to do is, once I put the tire on there and get the suspension loaded, I'll need to tighten up the upper control arm to the pivot arm, 2 bolts on either side. I'll need to tighten up the shock absorber bolt down here. I'll need to tighten up the lower control arm pivot points. The lower ball joint crown nut has been fastened to spec, and the cotter pin's been installed. Same with the upper ball joint. The link, the sway bar link, will need to be torqued down as well once it's under load, in addition to the mounts for the bushings for the sway bar. And that should be it for this side. Aside from getting those things all buttoned up, I'm gonna jump on the other side now. All right, so I torqued down sway bar bushing and also the sway bar link. Running out of daylight, but the last thing you want to do is button up your upper control arm bolts, 150 foot-pounds, both sides of the upper control arm. And then you also want to button up your shock absorber, and that should be good. We'll catch you next time.